My name is Plant. I'm an academic at the University of Reading, and the project is to do with high-resolution numerical weather forecasting, especially with a focus on extreme or high-impact events. So to give a little bit of context for that, what we mean by high-resolution weather forecast is one where the grid spacing in the model might be of order about 1 kilometre or so. That's quite an important scale actually, because we're especially interested in convective storms that may have a kind of physical scale in the real world of a few kilometres. So 1 kilometre is kind of what you need to be able to represent these things properly. And they're important because the convective storms are often what drives the really high impact weather. So events such as flash flooding or extreme wind gusts are very often associated with these storms on those kind of few kilometre scales. It's relatively new to be able to do this, to be able to run the models at these scales. So it's perhaps a decade or so that operational centres have been trying to do them, and they've been sort of slowly coming on stream over that time. But the field is starting to get a little bit more mature now. So not very long ago, everyone was just still very excited that you could run these things at all and start to see these storms, and I was just really thrilled with to look at the outputs. But we're starting to get to a point now where we're less just excited about the whole thing and much more looking into the details and much more aware that these things are very useful but far from perfect in some ways, and we started to become more aware the deficiencies are there. So that's the kind of situation that you would be walking into, and what we'd like to do is to kind of really start to address those deficiencies properly now, to understand scientifically where they're coming from and how we can improve those. So the two in particular that we were interested in looking at for this project, one is to do with the spatial structure of the storms. So at one extreme, the storms may be just dotted or higgledy-piggledy around the country. Another extreme, they can have a much more sort of organised kind of structure. Maybe they form some line or some other feature. And what we tend to find if we use different models to simulate these same events is some of the models are very prone to generate organised behaviour. Others are very reluctant to do that, and reality actually seems to live somewhere in between those two extremes. So what we need to do is to kind of really unpack that and understand that properly. That's much more in a sort of anecdotal impression from the forecast users rather than something we really understand properly at the moment. The other kind of slightly troubling aspects of these models is that the people who are running the models in tropical locations, let's say the West Africa, are typically going for quite different sort of settings and model choices compared to people running in a more mid-latitude situation, such as over the UK. Now, in reality, the fundamental physics and dynamics of the atmosphere is not completely different in those different parts of the world, of course. So really that's pointing to some deficiencies in the model that are being sort of covered up in slightly different ways depending which processes are slightly more important in different places in the world. So that's unsatisfactory in some ways, and what we'd really like to do, we feel, is that if we understood the science better, we ought to be able to bring the settings together and get a good setup that works well right away across the world. So it's for those reasons that we're choosing to focus on the weather forecasting over South Africa for this project. The reason there is that South Africa is not sort of mid-latitude location. It's not your tropical location. It has behaviour that looks sometimes like one, sometimes like the other, sometimes somewhere in between, depending on the time of year and where you are in the country and so on. So really, they can't sort of budge this situation by choosing one or the other. To get a good forecast there, you really do have to address this problem and come to some setting that will work well in a much more general sense. So the people involved in this project, apart from myself as an academic here, there's another academic, Torvald Stein at the university, who's expert at sort of confronting the models with the observations particularly. But we've also got involvement from the forecasting services, so we're interested in developing and understanding the Met Office forecast model, so we have a Met Office supervisor involved, but also an involvement from the South African weather services, so we can really understand the problems that they face and what improvements they need to see. So that's a brief description of the project. Very happy to be sort of contacted by email, or please take a look at the advert online, which will give you a bit more information again.